on the question of how you would turn extremists into moderates, you have been a little dismissive of what are commonly called the root causes of extremism in the Muslim world. You pretty much dismiss the idea that the problem is humiliation or insults to their dignity. At one point you write that you characterize the conventional view as stressing the collusion of Western powers with corrupt dictatorships, endemic poverty, lack of economic opportunity, so on. You say, I will argue that we can ignore all of these things or treat them only to place them safely on the shelf. In other words, more or less dismiss them. Because the world is filled with poor, uneducated, and exploited peoples who do not commit acts of terrorism. I mean...
And there's another part of that, that it's also filled with middle-class, well-educated engineers and architects who fly planes into buildings. Yeah. So it's a perfect association.
As for the first part, and I should stress, these are not the particular root causes I would personally stress, like poverty so much, but there are root causes I would stress. And you're kind of dismissive of root causes, and you say we can dismiss them because the world is full of poor, uneducated peoples who do not commit acts of terrorism. Well, the world is full of people who smoke cigarettes and don't get lung cancer, right? But you wouldn't deny that smoking causes lung cancer.
No, but this is the problem. I'm all in favor of understanding root causes. I just think that the root causes of certain acts of violence, not all violence, but certain acts of violence, really are right there on the surface, because these people are telling us why they're doing what they're doing. All the variables that in our case, poverty, mistreatment at the hands of powers, etc.
So what are they telling us that is the real cause?
Jihad. I mean, to speak specifically about Islam, we're talking...
Right, but the doctrine of jihad has been on their books forever. And yet, there are times when it doesn't surface and times when it does. There must be something that's changing.
Well, yeah, it's the fact that you can't really live in isolation in our world anymore. I mean, the fact that a Muslim will go to Hamburg to find work and live in Hamburg and be confronted with the shocking evidence of sin that is Western culture, find it so spiritually oppressive that he's driven into his insular and an increasingly radicalized Muslim community, spends all day long at his mosque talking about the pleasures that await martyrs in paradise and just the horrors of infidel society, won't look a woman in the eye because it's such a spiritual transgression. And this is Muhammad Atta.
So modernity is kind of the root cause.
Yeah. Well, no, but it's not. It's modernity. Modernity is fine. I mean, there's other problems we can talk about in modernity. But the root cause is, I mean, if you want to ascribe it to humiliation, it is a religious-based humiliation. It is a theological humiliation. These are people who think they have the perfect word of the creator of the universe. They expect their religion to be triumphant in this life. And their societies are foundering because, for a variety of reasons, and testifying to the inadequacy of their worldview at some level. So they're humiliated because they're not in power, and they expect to be in power, and they view all of the inequities in the world through the lens of their religious literalism. Now, if they had a different religious literalism, we wouldn't have a problem. So I mean, one thing I argue is that Islamic fundamentalism is only a problem for us because the fundamentals of Islam are a problem for us. We're not, if Jains were, I mean, Jainism is this religion of India, incredibly peaceful. They're vegetarians. They won't kill a fly. If the Jains were poor and suffering, high levels of illiteracy, et cetera, the Jains would not be practicing suicide bombing because they would be viewing this subjugation through the lens of their Jainism, which, however irrational it might be, it has a very different behavioral and logical consequence.
Well, there are certainly some religious doctrines that are less amenable to radicalization than others, but that's not the same as saying that there are kind of no factors on the ground over which we have control that exert a radicalizing influence, right? And would you accept my point that just the analysis as you do it, you say these can't be the cause because there are people who possess these properties who don't become radicals. Well, that is like saying smoking can't cause cancer because there's smokers who don't get cancer. And you're saying, and then you're in turn saying what you added, which is that then there are affluent, well-educated people who do become terrorists. Well, there are people who have lung cancer who didn't smoke. I mean, all four quadrants are always filled up, and it just seems to me the problem is sufficiently complicated that you need a subtle kind of analysis. I mean, more subtle than sentences like this are.
Well, I see. I don't think it's sufficiently complicated in that we're really talking about the behavioral consequences of ideas. You know, if you believe that it's raining outside and you don't want to get wet, you're going to reach for an umbrella. And so to ask for, well, what was the proximate cause of your reaching for an umbrella? Well, we could talk neurology, we could talk your upbringing, we could talk, you know, socioeconomics, but the proximate cause is you were convinced it's raining outside and you don't want to get wet. And that, as a first approximation, is a good way to explain your behavior. We have an easily as apparent an explanation of religious violence. I mean, you look at why does someone like...
But what's the explanation?
Well, because these people really believe what they say they believe.
Well, sure they do, but again, this is not the way Islamic doctrine has expressed itself traditionally. And your assertion that all it is kind of the certain aspects of modernity that are encountered in recent, whatever your explanation is, it's just not self-evidently obvious. There are lots of candidates for what forces on the ground are leading to this change. And, it just seems to me it's a complicated...
Well, let me just add one piece here, because I think, and this may be surprising to you, I think the situation would actually be worse if they had better education and more money. And I mean, if Islam was actually as viable in the face of modernity as, secular capitalism, if you could live in the worldview of the Taliban and really become a superpower, that is the worst possible situation. So the idea that somehow, if they only had more money, more stability, more technical progress, more affluence, then these problems would go away. I doubt that highly.
I think a lot of moderate Muslims are in that category, and if you in that category are not moderate, it's true. But a lot of the kind of Pakistani Muslims who send their kids to Oxford and so on, they fly business class. They do business with people who aren't Muslims. Yeah. They love people who aren't Muslims because they're getting something out of their relationship with people who aren't Muslims. They feel part of that world. They feel they're getting something out of involvement in that world. And it's possible that if you could give more Muslims that sense, it's at least possible. I think we both agree that they look at the world out there and view it as hostile toward their religion. And the question is, are the forms of hostility that they perceive subject to our successful manipulation in a way that doesn't compromise our own values, kind of inexcusably?
Well, let me just clarify one thing. I'm not talking about all Muslims, and I'm certainly not talking about an ethnicity. I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm talking about ideas. So I'm talking about white kids from Marin County who go to fight with the Taliban, as much as I'm talking about people like Osama bin Laden. And what you're describing there is the moderating virtues of secularism and globalization and just having everyone's culture freely available. The fact that you can go to an Indian restaurant tonight and have Indian food, that has a certain moderating influence upon human consciousness, because it's just, we don't have the right to our provincialism anymore at some level, because everything is in plain view. And that's a good thing, and that should happen to the Muslim world. And we can only hope that it happens as quickly as possible, and that will be part of the mechanism that gives us Muslim moderates. And another piece here that we haven't mentioned, which I think is very important, is the empowerment of women in the Muslim world. I mean, we have 50% of the Muslim world that is living a life of really oppressive subjugation under the edicts of Islam. And it doesn't matter how many women you can stand up in burqas who say they want to be in burqas. I mean, ultimately they're wrong to want to be in burqas. I mean, this is something that I argue in my book. And we have to win a war of ideas with them. And
the women are wrong to think that?
Yeah. I mean, I think any woman who, you can raise a child so that at the 16th year of life she will stand up and say, I want to be in a burqa. And I don't think we should take that testimony too seriously, ultimately. I mean,
well, but everyone has been brought up with something and have been indoctrinated in some sense, including you. I mean, I would also take the view, on behalf of a certain moral relativism, that, you know, everyone I know who's kind of in my shoes, has daughters on the verge of teenagehood, has a certain amount of trepidation because of the nature of modern Western culture. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the teenage years. And some traditional societies, not just Muslim, but you know, traditional societies in various faiths, are set up in a way that those things are less likely to go wrong. And I don't mean I want to move to those places. I just mean I think I should be a little careful. I'm not really in a position to say that they've got everything wrong. I don't, you know, support polygamy or anything, but
well, let's take an extreme, because I'm totally sympathetic with that concern. I don't have kids yet, and so I can only imagine what it's like to be a father of girls, but I can well imagine that, you know, your teenage girls are growing up and you see the sexualization of culture, and that's problematic, and there's some more or less optimal way to balance this. You know, personal freedom, not stigmatizing sexuality, and yet also protecting girls from, you know, the rapaciousness of the male world, and et cetera, et cetera. And then you have various possible reactions to that. I mean, you have Abercrombie and Fitch, that is, we've learned, is designing thong underwear for 8-year-olds, and you know, they get boycotted by the marketplace because that has gone too far. But then you have Mullah Omar over here, who's you know, getting girls stoned to death for fornicating, or even getting raped. I mean, honor killing is really the reductio ad absurdum of that approach to problematizing female sexuality. And I think there's going to be a balance point somewhere, and I just am quite sure that the Islamists of the world, or the Christian fundamentalists, have not found that balance point.
Okay. Let me back into kind of this same question about what the ultimate sources of bad behavior are, like, you know, violence and so on, by talking about a criticism that you got for your first book, and then you addressed it in the second book, Letter to a Christian Nation, as well as a kind of addendum in your first book. It's the Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot question. You know, all these people seem to have been more or less atheists. Hitler's religiosity is a little bit disputed, but he certainly wasn't professing Christian faith when he was doing his most horrible things. And the point these people are making, I mean, when you look at it, it's kind of striking. I mean, almost all national political leaders of the 20th century did profess a religious faith clearly. The people I just mentioned account for the overwhelming majority of atrocities inflicted by political leaders on their own people. It seems natural to conclude that the most dangerous thing in the world is an atheist political leader. I mean, just statistically, you seem to be compelled to that conclusion. Now, I know you have answers, right? But it's a notable fact.
Yeah, I just think it's once again, it's an artifact of the words we're using. I mean, using a word like atheist, and somehow then imagining that because Stalin was irreligious and an enemy of Christianity, his genocide of his people was somehow caused by his opposition to religion or his lack of faith in God. And I just think that's you know, it's a false.
One needs some explanation of something so statistically improbable that the tiny minority of non-religious political leaders would do almost all of the domestic slaughter done in the 20th century. That is so statistically unlikely that it's not enough to say, I don't think it was their atheism. Well, how do you explain the bizarre statistics there?
Well, I can just see why they did what they did. I mean, they had beliefs that they were quite articulate about, and they were moved by their beliefs. You know, Hitler believed that the Jews were the cause of the downfall of German society, and the Jews were just racial poison and had to be exterminated. And that was, so now where did he get that idea? I mean, conveniently for my thesis, you trace that idea back, you find that anti-Semitism is a product of religion. It's a product of Christian fulminating against the Jews for thousands of years. The idea that the Jews stand in repudiation of Christ.
But he also wanted to wipe out gypsies and handicapped people. Did he inherit that from Christianity?
Well, no, I mean, there are other kinds of tribal hatreds that come.
But that's my point. It seems to me in that case, nationalism is a more elegant explanation than religion. Fanatical German nationalism accounts for all the people he killed, whereas religion, as an explanation, leaves some of the things still unaccounted for.
No. Well, they're just different. This is not a contradiction. They're just different reasons why people kill people. You know, there's greed too. You know, he wanted a 1,000-year Reich. You know, he wanted to be. There's just megalomaniacal thinking. He wanted to be, you know, the Führer to the entire world. But when you ask, where did anti-Semitism come from? Why is it when the stormtroopers moved into Poland that the Poles so easily set upon their Jewish neighbors and the Latvians and the Lithuanians, and why is it that people were so gleeful about exterminating the world's Jews? You cannot get anti-Semitism without this history of demonizing Jews.
Then where did the anti-Gypsy, if that has no comparable history in religious doctrine? I mean, the question.
No, like, where does racism come from? You know,
well, exactly. You see,
there is tribalism.
Here's the question I'm asking. In cases like this, where it would seem to me like it has more to do with nationalism or other forces, you tend to insist that it's a form of religion.
Well,
but I mean, you're right. And you in addressing this, you say communism of Stalin Mao was little more than a political religion. At its heart was a rigid ideology. It was cultic. It was irrational.
Right.
Well, just as much as you could say this was a political religion, you could say when religion reaches kind of toxic levels of group cohesion, it is a theological nationalism, okay? And the larger question I'm getting at is, isn't it possible? I mean, my view is religion is actually composed of a lot of parts of human nature. One is this kind of groupishness that can turn aggressive, has to do with lots of other parts, but isn't it possible that religion is just one manifestation of this form of human nature? There are others, such as nationalism. The problem is this part of human nature, and the question of what circumstances excite it, arouse it, is one that isn't fundamentally about religion. And whereas I from your writing, I get the sense that you think a huge majority of the world's problems boil down to religion per se.
Yeah, well, let me reconcile it here, because I think it's easily done. I think the problem is dogma. I think the problem is false certainty that people find incredibly energizing, and false certainties that are immune to criticism because you have some social context in which it has become taboo to criticize these certainties. And when these certainties are ascendant and they are emotionally empowering and they balkanize your world into us-them categories, where you have, in the case of religion, Christians against Muslims against Jews. In the case of politics, you have the true believers of the Reich and everyone else. These divisive certainties, which are immune to criticism, that's the problem. So dogma is the problem, and my argument is just that religion has more than its fair share of dogma, and it's the only case in which dogma is not actually a pejorative word. I mean, we talk about religious dogma as though dogma were a necessary feature of the whole enterprise, and so that's what I find to be so dangerous about religion. And it's also these are differences between people which they are willing to live and die for in a way that doesn't tend to be true in politics. It can be true in politics, but it's not. It can be true of Red Sox and Yankees fans, but it doesn't tend to be true.
There are uniquely destructive doctrines, such as the idea that if you kill a lot of people, you will get a special place in heaven. I'm not so sure that the afterlife intrinsically is a bad. I mean, I don't know what the scorecard is on how much good has been done by people who thought they would, go to heaven by doing nice things to people as opposed to people, But there are certainly uniquely problematic and toxic religious doctrines. But the question I'm trying to back into is, again, my view, which is just different from yours, I think, that religion is often kind of a mediating variable. It's mediating a part of human nature that that is unfortunately excited under certain circumstances. And I'm glad to hear you say that you think it often assumes secular form. I mean, I thought, right after 9/11, when for a while you really couldn't question anything George Bush said. I don't know if you remember this, but it was like really unpopular to question that, which I think is an unhealthy situation. I would also say that what you just described as being part of a worldview, us against them, and attributing a kind of unity to them, is something that some people, that's a way that some people characterize George Bush's worldview, including a part of it that I think you buy into, kind of, the idea that the problem is Islamic fascism writ large, as opposed to my view that, if you look at the various Muslims in the different parts of the world who are unhappy, originally their unhappiness was growing out of separate grievances. In Palestine, originally, it was very much an issue about Israel, and it was not very religious 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know if you remember, but the opposition to Israel had much more the character of Arab nationalism 40 years ago than it does now. So anyway, that's. Why don't you say whatever you'd say, and then we can move on?
I think that it's not. You can start at it from the other end. You can say, all right, the enemy is not religion. Let's not talk about religion. Let's just talk about evidence and what is rational to believe about the world. Let's just start from first principles, and let's be intellectually honest. And then whenever we encounter people who have bad evidence and bad arguments for their beliefs, we're going to criticize them. We're not going to admit them to our graduate schools. We're not going to promote them to public office because they're being irrational, and we're going to stigmatize flagrant irrationality. Well, then who are we going to wind up stigmatizing when we do that? We are just going to be blasting religion all day long when we do that, but just by necessity. Because when you hear what religious people think about the world, when you hear that 45% of Americans think Jesus is coming back in 50 years, when you hear that 53% of Americans think the universe is 6,000 years old, and if you did these polls in the Muslim world, we would no doubt get flabbergasting data. You would stand in perpetual criticism of the bogus certainties of the better part of humanity. And the question is, how do you win a war of ideas in the face of that? That's one question. The other question is, what do you do when these certainties are arrayed in such a way that they're causing people to fight over incompatible, religious claims upon real estate, for instance? The fact that the Jewish settlers, need this real estate because it's been sanctified by the footprints of Abraham, and if we offered to give them British Columbia, they wouldn't take it. They would be free from Muslim hatred, and there'd be great peace. There'd be a great peace dividend born of that, but they wouldn't take it for religious reasons. And so it seems to me that however you want to mince words here, we have a major problem between what's going on under the name of all these rival religious conceptions of the world and the tensions of modernity, the fact that we are trying to build a global civilization.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree on that. And the question is how you change people's views.
Yeah.
And
I'm the first to admit that I am one voice that maybe should not be duplicated too much. I don't think everyone should speak the way I speak. I'm playing a certain role. Dan Dennett's playing a different role, which I appreciate. There's a good cop, bad cop routine that I think is appropriate in different contexts. But I think we should be honest about what is reasonable to believe and why actually people do get up in the morning and decide to, kill their daughters for being raped or et cetera.